Uh, we are all delighted to welcome you. This session is really about what practitioners think is the need for a science policy interface for food systems. And it's part of an ongoing dialogue that will unfold in the weeks and months ahead. We're also delighted to use this session as an opportunity to release a report called Everyone's at the Table, which is the preliminary report of the European Commission's high-level expert group's reflections on food system science and the policy interface. So as a housekeeping note, speakers, I'm going to keep us to time and we've got a packed schedule. I'm going to do that sort of clinking glass sound. I hope you can hear that when you're 1 minute away from your end of time. And we're going to begin with Peter Werheim, Head of Unit for Food Systems and Bioeconomy at the European Commission, DG of Research and Innovation. Peter, you have the floor right now. So if you'd come off of mute and put your camera on, that would be great.
Thank you, Evan. Dear colleagues and friends, a great pleasure to welcome you and join you also on behalf of the European Commission. The Directorate General for Research and Innovation, where I'm working, co-creates with other thematic directorates the EU's research and innovation policy. Our research framework program is called Horizon Europe. That is our key funding instrument, and within this funding instrument we also have thematic research and innovation initiatives, which will also, among other things, support the design and development of food system policies. In that respect, since 2016 we have developed our strategic 2030 food research and innovation framework, in which we argue that we need more than just technological innovation. We also need institutional and governance changes in order to meet the challenges of today's food system. In the context of this Food 2030 framework, we decided to make a contribution to the question of how the link between food systems, science and food policy could be reinforced, and as a tangible input to this UN Food System Summit, we established at the beginning of this year in 2021 this expert group and asked the expert group to investigate the needs, the gaps and the options to strengthen the international science policy interfaces in view of the food systems. The work of this expert group is meant to provide an evidence-based assessment of how the science policy interfaces in the food systems could be improved. The expert group is composed of 19 excellent experts, food systems experts from all around the world and from many different disciplines, who will work over an 18-month period until May 2022. The expert group has worked very hard over the past 6 months, and I'm now delighted, yes, to announce that the report you have mentioned, Evan, is released. It's entitled "Everyone at the Table: Co-creating Knowledge for Food Systems Transformation." The report has been edited by Patrick Webb and Roberta Sonino. Let me just be explicit and say upfront that the European Commission has no preconceived, no preferred outcome on what the best options for a reinforced link between food system science and food policy could be. The Commission appreciates very much also the work done by existing science policy interfaces, but we also want to inspire and inform the debate on how to strengthen the governance of the food systems in the EU and globally. We aim to continue this discussion, for instance, on the occasion of World Food Day this year. On the 16th of October, the Commission will hold its Farm to Fork conference, which will be another opportunity to follow up on this debate. We therefore also welcome a very wide, open and inclusive debate on this topic and on the findings of the expert groups, because we aspire, or the expert group will also continue its work, and these discussions can feed into the second phase of the work of the expert group, which will include a deeper dive into the options to arrive at recommendations only next year in May 2022. I take this opportunity to thank very much all of the experts in this expert group, the chairman of this group, Tom Arnold, and the vice chair, Patrick Webb, and Roberta Sonino for their hard work, valuable insights, and the commitments to this very important process. I hope that all participants in this meeting will find this interim report also inspiring, and I wish us all a very successful event. Back to you, Evan.
Peter, thank you. And hey, as part of that expert group, I just want to say what an honor it's been, and how much I've enjoyed interacting with you and the colleagues you brought together to work on this. So thank you for that personally. And that's a great segue. Next, folks, we have Patrick Webb, the Alexander McFarlane Professor of Nutrition at Tufts University. As noted, Patrick is the vice chair of the expert group, and Patrick is going to provide us with some high-level messages from this preliminary report that represents the first 6 months of work by the EC group. So Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Evan, I like to think of us as not just not the expert group, but the engaged group. It's such an engaged group, and I emphasize that because this is not the work of 1 or 2 or 3 people. This is very much an important team effort of people really engaged in these issues. In just very few minutes that we have, we all want to hear from our amazing panelists. I'm just going to give very high level overview of the report, which is not a long report. We hope you will access it and read it yourselves. So I'm literally just going to give some high order flesh to the bones that Peter just said. So these are international, independent, engaged people, scientists, practitioners, who've been commissioned to explore options. That's really the key. We have to explore options that can potentially strengthen international, from global down to national, down to subnational, science policy interfaces that support policymakers and other stakeholders, practitioners all along the food system, to achieve transformation that is so important. And the word support I highlight because there's nothing prescriptive here or preordained. Lots done today, as Peter mentioned, contributes already significantly to this important agenda, but very few people would accept that what we have is enough to move the needle sufficiently to meet the urgency and the scale of actions that are required to achieve transformation. Now, specifically, we're looking at options, right? Options to strengthen, I use the word interfaces, plural, because we're not looking at a single mechanism or institution or body. What we're looking at are what are the options that can help strengthen science and other forms of knowledge, their ability to inform action with evidence that is credible and rigorous. So that means assessing the implications of any choices. The SBI just stands for Science Policy Interface. What are the implications of what we have and any choices for the future in guiding and supporting research and innovation at many different scales and for a range of stakeholders, because legitimacy and transparency are absolutely essential. And again, as Peter said, this is intended to foster dialogue and diplomacy both within and outside of the EU to inspire, that's Peter's word, greater engagement in this key issue. Now, I am putting this advisedly, this slide. What this is not an exercise about is replacing or duplicating or negating what is already in place. Absolutely not. The idea is to enhance and support what we already have and make things better across the board. Therefore, we are not surprisingly not proposing a one-size-fits-all solution. We do not have a preference. We, not just the Commission, but we, this group of engaged individuals, have a preconceived or preferred option ahead of time. We are in the depths of our own discussion. And we do not seek to circumvent governance structures that promote already dialogue on these issues, especially those supporting a rights-based net. So I think just it's important to understand that this is not what we're trying to do. What this report released today, just to paraphrase Winston Churchill, is that this is not the end of the end of a process. Nor is it the beginning. It's the beginning of the process. It may be towards the end of the beginning, but I won't go too far into that. This report is simply elaborating the work of 6 months, focusing on principles and the agenda that needs to be pursued. How do we generate actionable evidence? And I use the word evidence because it's not just science in its traditional form, but evidence of all kinds, including knowledge of all kinds, particularly at the intersections where disciplines butt up against each other and across sectors, because we have complex problems to deal with. The food systems transformation deals with planetary problems at the climatic level, health problems at the planetary level, economic problems of inequity and social justice, environmental degradation, you name it. These are challenging planetary challenges that require transformative action at all scales, and this is not going to be easy. There are lots of transactional obstacles, things that prevent forward momentum, particularly if we get stuck in our disciplines and silos and sectors, and we have to somehow cut across those, break through those, and bring people together by bringing knowledge to work together, which means bringing science, other forms of knowledge, including traditional knowledge, to inform action. But it's not just informing action, it's how do we better connect and network such expertise and the stakeholders across all existing and potential future platforms at many different scales, not just global, again, regional, national, and subnational, right? This isn't just about scientists talking to scientists or government policymakers to policymakers. So SBIs, we believe, have to go beyond just generating information, although that is critical, the right information that can support what policymakers need, what other stakeholders need to make decisions. It should facilitate the use, the uptake, the belief in such information through transparency, equity, and access to all forms of data, and acting as a voice for setting priorities that feeds into national and subnational visions of what that transformation and agenda should look like. So that information, the evidence of all kinds, has to be independent. It has to be transparent. It has to be believable, credible, usable, avoiding bias, avoiding political and other forms of capture. And therefore, it has the systems that generate and distill and disseminate such information also have to be independent and avoiding bias and capture. So again, there are strong elements of this today, many important things already being done, but the information that we need and the policies and the investments needed are still very limited and in short supply. So we have to move forward. What exists today isn't enough. We truly believe that we can do better. There's urgency and scale to be addressed. Therefore, the panel is going to be discussing a lot of these the second bullet, a lot of these issues. What can we adapt from existing functions and networks to have more interconnectedness and more coherent activity in what we already have today? But what could we also enhance in terms of existing capacities and capabilities or future capacities that need broader mandates, different kinds of funding, different kinds of engagement? Blended models that bring together networking, dissemination, co-creation, all matters at various levels. And that's what we have to explore going forward. This doesn't stop, as Peter said, at the summit itself. The summit is simply a milestone in a process that goes forward into the future. So finally, transformative action is so urgent, so important that those who are engaged in seeking how to achieve transformation need to demand more from the systems that generate information, whether science, evidence, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, those actors need to demand more of the evidence, and the evidence has to do more and better to serve that transformation agenda. That is exactly what this panel is here for today. That's what this group is here for in the longer term, to try and engage with stakeholders around the world and make this happen. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hey, Patrick, thank you very much. And you know, you put a tremendous amount of hard work into writing the report, and others have said it. I'd just like to echo it. Excellent job. I'm really honored to be associated with this effort, and so thanks for speaking to it. If it's okay with folks, I'd now like to ask Barb and Thembi to come off mute and turn their cameras on. I think we want to get the agenda gone, and hopefully we can get Barb and Thembi up for our panel discussion. Barb Schwarzentruber is the executive director of a program called Our Food Future, which is a smart cities project in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, where I'm from. So Barb's a neighbor of mine. And Thembi Wakambamba is a program manager at the Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Policy Analyst Network. FAN-ARPAN. It's a Pan-African network working on food systems. So we invited Barb and Thembi to join us to provide essentially a practitioner's perspective. And also both have participated in a number of very diverse and quite different food system dialogues as part of the UN FSS process. So I've got a couple of questions, and Barb, I'd like to start with you before turning to Thembi. Barb, specifically thinking of that food dialogue process, how do you think that better access to data or science or knowledge, some sort of empirical insight, might have or maybe have not helped the dialogue process? And I'll let you answer the question, and then hopefully we'll get Thembi on and she'll answer it as well.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and congratulations on the report. It's very well done and very easily consumable. So thank you. When I think about my participation in the dialogues and reflect on that, I think about the big task ahead of us, which is, as you've said, food system transformation. And to me, for that to happen, you need three things. And the first is a really good understanding of what our present model is for the food system, its limitations and impacts, which I think we have, and science and experiential evidence have been pretty clear and explicit in describing the impacts and the limitations. Second, I think you need a model of a future state. And through the dialogue process, we've had multiple proposals and visions of what could be. And the dialogues have really brought together diverse people and ideas to share a vision for the future from multiple vantage points. But third, you need a proposed course of action and pathways to get there to that vision. And that's the one I think that has us a bit stumped. There are competing interests and policies that are at best unconnected, if not conflicting. There are disconnected actions at the local and global level. And there's an elevation of technology as sort of a bright, shiny object that's a bit distracting and seen as a single solution. So I think this is where the role that you've laid out in your paper for the science policy interface comes in. We really need some rigor as part of that dialogue, a bit of a container that helps us work across multiple disciplines that you need to make the change. We aren't all going to follow the same path, and we shouldn't, but we do need a theory of change, and we need an approach to testing interventions and to learning, so that we can figure out what are the innovations that work for whom and under what circumstances. So it's really a massive system level change that has to happen on multiple levels across policy, research, and programs in a very congruent and thoughtful manner, so we don't create the kind of unintended horrific externalities that we're dealing with now. It's really a ginormous, not a scientific term, co-design and co-creation process that does require that science policy action framework that drives the transformation towards a vision at a fairly rapid pace. And I'm not sure we've seen that done on this kind of scale before, but we do know it's possible and that we have really all the willing actors at the table.
Well, and you've been at the front lines of that, Barb, with your work on the Smart Cities project at Guelph, where you've been forced to work with academics like me to try to get things done. So well done to you. Thembi, I want to give you the floor now. What do you think the dialogue process and the role of evidence broadly defined can bring together? Thembi?
Thanks, Stephen, and congratulations to everybody on the report. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. So for me, the dialogue process has been really an exciting one. It has been pegged as one process where that is dependent on the engagement of all citizens, right? And having the independent dialogue process has actually opened the doors to get a lot of people involved. And as FANAPAN, we've been involved in convening dialogues in East and Southern Africa and with our partners in West and North Africa. So we have had our tentacles spread quite wide. But one thing I think that I must note is that the dialogue process also came at a really difficult time because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that there were limitations and restrictions in terms of how engaged we could really get. Instead of having those sort of face-to-face type dialogues, we had to move to online dialogue processes. And I think to some extent, we really have to be honest with the fact that not everybody, especially in Africa, has access to these technologies. You know, they cannot be on Zoom, on WebEx and things like that. So there is a big group of people that have been left out of those dialogue processes. And I thought it was really important to sort of highlight that up front. Back to the question now on the sort of science policy interface. I think we have quite a mountain to climb on that one. It is true that understanding food systems and the implications of the changes that are required really is about involving scientists and policymakers. But that also limits the sort of people that can participate. I would like to see it more open to, because policymakers traditionally, when we use that term, we are limiting it to people in government and people in sort of political spaces. But there's a whole group of people that should also be part of that discussion. Farmers, we have, private sector. When we don't explicitly call them out by name and just talk science and policy, we are in a way excluding them. And it'll be really good to sort of open up that space of science and policy interface to make sure that we get the voices of other non-traditional policy stakeholders that need to have a sort of a voice into that. But then also for me, the other challenge, I think, especially in the context that I work in Africa, is this tension between research-driven policy and also demand-driven research. That's something also that needs to be unbungled, because who demands the research? Is it the policymakers? Do they need it to be able to make the decisions about the future, to be able to address the challenges that they are currently facing? Or are the researchers leading the pack in that direction? So those are the two things I think maybe as a first start that I wanted to just bring and highlight, to say those are some of the issues that we really need to be focusing on.
Thembi, I'm so glad you raised the fact that so many folks on this planet can't access technologies, digital technologies, let alone Zoom or WebEx. And that's a real constraint and a barrier to including those non-conventional voices at the table. Your point's so well taken. With that said, I'd like to go a little bigger and maybe in reverse order now. So Thembi, then Barb. You have a bunch of folks on this call who are interested in practical advice about how to design a good science policy interface, or interfaces, because as Patrick said, there is no singular answer. So Thembi, brainstorm with us. How would a science policy interface be designed that would better suit your needs and the needs of the people you're talking to?
All right, so I'm thinking maybe possibly four things that I'm thinking of. One is the mechanism that happens. we are very good at having scientific committees, right? But we need to open them up to be more multi-sectoral and more multi-scale. A lot of these things happen really well at international level, or maybe even at regional level, looking at the Africa setup. But when it comes to the national and the local level, it's not so well done. It's almost as if the national then represents the whole, and sometimes that information doesn't trickle down. So if we are forming these sort of multi-sectoral scientific committees that are supposed to inform the scientific agenda, can we have the structures done in such a way that we have them at local level and at national level, so that the local feeds the national and the national feeds the regional? That's the first thing. Then the second thing, I think we also need to be more open-minded in terms of what the scientific evidence that we are gathering is. It's all good and proper to work with researchers and fancy research institutions, you know, in universities and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of local knowledge that doesn't get captured. So it's important for us to be able to also tap into those sources of local indigenous knowledge, right? And the third thing, I think for us in Africa, we have a need to actually look at investing in sort of longitudinal data collection. That is not being done well. We capture data here and there, but then we don't use it, or we don't go back and how the situation has changed. So that's another area that I think can also be improved. And then the last thing I would want to say, we also want to have open dialogues right across the board, across sectors. Food systems is not just about agriculture. It's about environment, it's about health, you know, it's about a whole lot of other things that need to come right. So we need to have that open dialogue right across the board to make sure that we are including everyone that is at stake in our food systems. Thanks. I think I'll end it.
Yeah, so you've raised so many great points. Barb, maybe I'll bring you back into the conversation now, because I know you're working at the municipal level that Thembi is talking about, but you're part of some pretty exciting national and global networks. So maybe you could jump back on and close us off in this part of the session with a reflection on how a science policy interfaces could be better designed to meet the needs of you and your constituents.
Sure. So I mentioned that I think you need a theory of change to set on a pathway in order to do this kind of transformation. And our focus is to create a circular food economy within our region, but we are, as you said, highly connected nationally and even internationally. But we're being really ambitious about our work and it really is system level change. So we have a variety of pathfinding projects across every sector of the food system. We're working on the goals of, creating, making sure that people have access to affordable, nutritious food, creating new circular businesses, and finding new value from waste. And so we're actually turning our region into an urban-rural living lab or test bed, where hundreds of researchers, entrepreneurs, social innovators, businesses are collaborating on these projects, testing new interventions. And the thing is, our success is really going to be based on our ability to demonstrate whether those interventions are shareable, scalable, and replicable. And to do that, we really need to work with researchers on a system level. So we have a number of researchers and policymakers that are working with us on several of these projects. But what we're missing is a true system level partnership around implementation science. And by that, I mean we need an agility of real-time data analysis and insights that can help us course correct on the projects as we're implementing them. And as we certainly are acting on our experiential knowledge, but we need to interject some of that evidence-based knowledge as we go along. And a shared data and insights kind of platform that helps surface on-the-ground knowledge that we're generating is really important. There's some really interesting work around data trusts that is happening around the world that might prove as an interesting model. clearly we have to work, and we are working interdisciplinary in nature. So we need science and policy experts that can collaborate across those sectors and silos to support the work. But finally, some of this is really about the creation of new knowledge, and it's fundamentally a massive cultural change process, because food really reflects the soul of who we are in our culture. And so the science policy interface, I think, needs to help us by helping include a variety of new voices and actors, designers, architects, anthropologists, citizens, certainly, and artists. And so I come back to that concept of agility. So I'm not sure the current scientific paradigm doesn't often lend itself to that kind of agility and to the timeframes that we need, and to that bias for action that I think we need right now.
Yeah, agility is not something I would normally think of as when I think of a university. But Barb and Thembi, really, really great ideas. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. And I'd now like to shift a little bit, and I'd like to invite the Food and Agriculture Organization's Chief Scientist, Ismahani El-Awafi, to come on screen. And, please, thank you for joining us. And maybe you can share some of your thoughts on the role of science to inform policy making.
Thank you very much, Evan. And really, I wish this session with Barb and Thembi didn't finish. I think they gave us great ideas. I love the idea of agility. I love the idea of having the 3 steps to make it logic, like we analyze it and then we imagine what we want it to be. But let me give you a bit of my thinking around what's the role of science to inform policy in transforming agri-food systems. And particularly from the FAO perspective, I think we're really, really shocked by the numbers that just came in the SOFI just a few weeks ago, whereby we knew that we are off track to get to zero hunger, but we know now that we have 811 million people. And we already have the estimate that say more than 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. So just because we didn't talk so much about the issues, and we all know them, but I think it's really sobering to look at the numbers again. And the numbers are really bad when we think about biodiversity, when you hear that you have 1 million species that are at risk of extinction, when you know that it has worsened by 10% globally in the last 3 decades. So we think we are doing better, but in terms of loss of biodiversity, it's not getting better, even with the awareness and what have you. Just in the last 3 decades, I'm not talking in the last 60 years or so. So the crop diversity in farmers' field has decreased again. So in the 6,000 plant that we are focusing on only 4. When we look at the livestock, we have about 30% that are classified at risk of extinction. Same thing when you look at deforestation. We think we are doing better, but still the number says that 420 million hectares between 1990 and 2020 were converted to something else. We look at the fish stock and it's horrible. We moved from 90% in the 74 that was biologically sustainable to only 65%. So climate change, we all know it, how much water we use, how much input we use. So all these externalities makes that really sustainable and healthy food, it's often less affordable to consumers than they should be. And there was a recent paper by the scientific group of the UN Food System Summit that estimated that the externalities makes that our food worldwide cost about $19.8 trillion, whereas the current cost that we are able to look at, that we are reporting, it's 9 trillion. So it's double than the price that we had in mind, or that we think we know. So the pandemic was a wake-up call in many ways. It made us really rethink the way we produce, the way we process, the way we consume food. And also it shows us that we need to adopt system thinking approach if we want to get out of it and achieve SDGs, and particularly zero hunger and poverty, and ending poverty. So the objective of agricultural research needs to be aligned with the objective and preferences of the small scale producers. It has to be context specific, it It has to build on local and traditional knowledge, because small-scale producers still produce about 80% of our food. So those small-scale producers must be empowered to be able to co-design, to co-create, and to co-innovate. And in that perspective, science has a big role to play in accelerating that transformation towards a more sustainable agri-food system to reach a world free from poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And I think strengthening science policy interface is crucial, because scientific evidence, not only, as really Patrick Webb clarified, not only science per se, but evidence at large can inform policy and can catalyze the transition to a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient agri-food system. And of course, connecting scientists between each other, within the community is very important. Connecting them with policymakers and make sure that the communication is two ways. It's very important. As a newcomer to FAO, I'm really very much excited about the strategic framework, because the strategic framework is putting science and innovation at the center. And it's really clearly looking at leaving no one behind through more efficient, more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable agri-food system, not looking only to better production, but better production, better nutrition, better environment, and hopefully a better life. And I think FAO, by providing a neutral forum for policy dialogue and policy making, it works to improve the capacities of the stakeholder, the 194 member states we have, to strengthen their legal, their regulatory, and their policy framework, and to make sure that they create an enabling environment for food system transition or transformation. As you know, we host as FAO various global platforms that support the generation and application of scientific knowledge in policy making and the interaction between the scientific community, the knowledge holders, and the policy makers. One of the very famous ones is the HLPE, the High Level Panel of Experts, which is a science interface under the CFS, the World Food Security. And it's a very inclusive international intergovernmental platform for stakeholders to work together to ensure food security and nutrition for all. I'm sure you have seen many of the studies done by HLPE, and really what we could say about it, it's really based on a wide range of stakeholders, including the European Commission and many other knowledge holders across the world. And I think it does help to build bridges across countries, across regions, and across various scientific disciplines and professional background. But we have also to recognize that there is uneven global distribution of scientific capacity. So we have in the high-income country represent about 60% of the total scientific literature, whereas the high-income country represents only 15% of the total population. So the legitimacy of scientific advice needs to be strengthened. It must encompass the perspective of researchers for the least income countries. A last portion that was mentioned by the colleague, a large proportion of the knowledge led by indigenous people, it's still undocumented. It's still not understood. It's not integrated with science-driven technology and innovation. So we must foster open, inclusive, and two-way channel of communication and ensure that everyone in the agri-food system has a voice that is heard and that is taken in consideration.
Thank you very much. That was...
I have one last message, if you allow me, and that's that we must link efforts to advance science-based policy making at the global level to those undertaken at the regional and national level, with a view really to scaling up innovation efforts. In particular in Africa, and it was mentioned by Tembi, really the small-scale producer there lack access to the most basic innovation. So I think really collectively we can and we must do much more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ismahan. And thank you for your leadership, and your words around building bridges resonate very, very strongly with me indeed. Next up, we've got Gerda Verberg. Gerda, if you could come onto the camera. You're the United Nations Assistant Secretary General. You coordinate the Scaling Up Nutrition Program. Maybe you could add to this discussion by reflecting on what you would expect as inputs in terms of a science policy interface for us. Gerda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know where you are, but I'm always surprised to be invited to have to participate in conversations like this. Because I'm very down to earth and pragmatic. Beside the fact that I'm now coordinating the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, I've been a Minister of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality myself. And I've worked a lot with Wageningen University and with other CGR institutes. And I was very much focused on the question, all right, what is the challenge we want to tackle here? And how do we do this? Because when I started as minister, I noticed that the agenda for research was not always connected to the challenges that farmers and food producers or along the food value chain or people in nature and environment were expecting over the next 5 years to challenge. And farmers are entrepreneurs. They know exactly, they know their land, they know their property, they know their animals, and they are going to warn you or they give signals if they foresee challenges in the years ahead. And I think the collaboration between politicians and political decision makers and research and science need to be there, tailor-made to avoid, prevent, or deal with the challenges in the next time. So it is challenges oriented and solutions oriented. That's my first remark. My second, when it comes to food systems, it's a combination of fields that are not used to work together. And scientists do not always talk the language of farmers and do not understand the language of farmers, or farmers do not understand the language of scientists. I am against this, and I don't want to have translators between scientists and farmers or the end users of the science outcomes. I don't want to have implementation science. I don't want to be too rude here, but I think it's the challenge for scientists to also think about the implementation. And could it be, it should be part of the whole science circle to stand next to the end users, to implement it and try to bring the potential solutions to scale. Then you start to learn from each other, and the experience in the Netherlands, Wageningen researchers going to farms or greenhouses to implement and to have the conversation with the end users, also when it comes to results, is a very effective and a very inspiring one. So I think, and I was very happy to hear it, that it's also important to have the conversations with farmers, because it's not only indigenous wisdom, there is also a lot of farmers' wisdom included in designing the research and science project. Then funding. Very often funding, science follows the available funding. Turn it around. Make sure that funding of scientific research is following the demand. What is needed and what do we expect, and define it, and focus also on bring it to scale and implementation. And it's mentioned very often, and I'm happy about it, the intersectoral or interdisciplinary science. Have conversations throughout the whole scientific project with the users, because it keeps your research grounded. Then a next remark is, agree on a baseline. How are you going to measure results? And also please agree on a data system, because sometimes people tell me data is the new oil. Maybe data is also creating too much confusion. People in our countries are confused by the different data systems that are not connected, not communicating to each other. And everyone tries to have its own data system. Please think about it and find a solution to have a data system that can be used and is recognized by everyone. And finally, I have big hopes of all these projects and science that you will be able to support ending the misunderstanding between dealing with hunger and dealing with malnutrition. In too many countries, decision makers and policy advisors still think that if you get enough calories, if you increase production, you do a great thing for your country, and they don't talk about healthy food, diverse food, and what nutrition and nutritious food can do for your body, for your cognitive development, but also for the socio-economic development and the productivity of people and your economy. So these are my remarks and suggestions. Have conversations and start to talk the same language, because only then you can you will be able to identify the challenges that need a solution.
Gerda, thank you for that pragmatic set of pieces of advice, and I couldn't agree more. I wanted to shout hurrah a few times as you were speaking, so thank you for that. Hey, folks, as we bring this session to a close, I'd like to turn to my co-host, Patrick Charon from Montpellier. Patrick, you've got the floor to provide some summary remarks. I'm glad I got to moderate and you got to summarize. Patrick?
Thank you, Evan. Very difficult to summarize or synthesize. I will not do that. I will just take some key message. Well, first, it was a session to share and to listen. It's the preliminary report that has been issued today. It's a work in progress, and we were very happy to listen and hear tonight and to have some preliminary discussion that will continue. And it demonstrated an incredible interest, because you were more than 200 to register, despite a lot of competition for side events, the late announcement, the period, mid-July, the uncomfortable time zone for Europe and Africa, and 80 people connected. Well, we've heard very great dialogue this morning. Well, feedback on dialogues with the session moderated by David Navarro. And David insisted in 3 keywords: system, stakeholders, sustainability, the 3 S. Maybe we could add a 4th one, which is science. And we did not hear that much about science this morning, although it was present in many people's minds. And as especially when we talk about this interaction between science and policy, and as we put in the event we organized in February at the University of Montpellier, it's also about not only trying to design a nice tango between science and policy, but to build a symphony with many actors, and not just science on the one hand and policy on the other hand. I noticed at least 6 converging views tonight, or set of views that raise many questions. The first one, and I will be very quick. The main one is that there is not technological innovation on one hand and institutional on the other one. If we want to implement structural change, we have to think both related dimensions. Number 2, it's not only about SDG 2, it's about all SDG. Number 3, we are in a process, we need co-creation, not just translation of knowledge. And this means inclusivity, which raised a lot of concerns. You've provided a lot of examples if we want to contribute effectively to food system transformation. Number 4, it will be knowledge intensive. And this raised the questions of the complex links between knowledge and action. It's not just supply and demand of knowledge, and it's playing in an asymmetric world. Number 6, it's about transdisciplinary and recognizing the diversity of the source of knowledge. And number 6, what is very important is the learning processes with appropriate metrics, methods, approaches, and networking, like the living labs, and the issue of how to share, how to be agile. And I will finish with that one. Well, we discussed about interfaces at different scales, as you noticed, at the local, at the national, at the international, and what's more important, how to design agreements in asymmetric games to stimulate transformation, and how to connect those scales and those sectors all together. And at international level, which was very important, it's that apart from expertise and metrics, it's very also important to stimulate a learning process at that scale and to supporting science in low and medium income country, which means recognizing the existing mechanism, its legitimacy, putting in place principles of inclusivity, transparency, legitimacy, and independence, and building upon what exists. Ismahan mentioned the HLP, and moving towards addressing what are the gaps that we begin to identify all together. So I think it was great and inspiring, and that as a scientist, I will finish with this sentence. It's not only about science policy interface, it's also about implementing a different types of science unusual. Over to you.
Hey, thank you, Patrick. And we are slightly over time, so I am going to simply turn the torch over to Tom Arnold, the chair of the EC High-Level Expert Group, to close the session. Tom, sorry for making it rushed.
Thank you very much, Evan, and I will be very brief. Given that Patrick has so ably summarized our session this afternoon, I just want to really say thank you to a number of people. Thanks to all my colleagues on the expert group. I think it's a very diverse group, but I think we've managed to come together and work together. A particular thanks to you, Evan, and to Patrick Caron for suggesting this session and for putting in the work to do it, to make it happen. I think I've been very encouraged by the first 2 days of the pre-summit meeting. I think it's shown an energy and a level of debate which is very healthy. It's going to lead into the summit in September. And ultimately what that should be producing, I think, is an agreement that food systems, it has to be a much greater political priority than it has been. And we hoped that it will enable also some sense of direction as to how this prioritization should happen. And that's where I think our work, in a second phase of our work, comes in. We're very much putting this document out today as a document for debate. As Patrick says, we're in the listening mode. But when we come back to work after the summer, we're going to have to take on board what has emerged from the pre-summit and the summit itself, and that's going to help us guide our work into the future. I would very much take on board what Gerda has said. We have to be able to frame our final report in language that people can understand. People, policymakers and politicians, and a wider public. And I would see that as one of the critical things that we bear fully in mind as we do that work in the second half. So thank you to everybody who participated this evening in our session. Thank you to everybody who actually turned up and listened. And I hope you found it of value. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue. And with that, Evan, I'm closing. Is that correct? Okay.
That's
Thank
it.
you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.